This program is made possible in part by the Rouse Company Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. Maryland Poet Laureate Roland Flint talks with National Poet Laureate Robert Hass.
Welcome to The Writing Life. We have the rare pleasure this afternoon of a few minutes with the Poet Laureate of the United States, Robert Hass. Robert Hass has published 3 books of his own poems and collections of other kinds as well. Most recently, an anthology of haiku called the Essential Haiku, with about 100 or so haiku by each of Basho, Busan, and Issa. He is also a writer of criticism, and his 20th Century Pleasures a few years ago received the National Book Critics Circle Award in criticism. He has lots of other distinctions, including a grant from the MacArthur Foundation, and we're going to talk a little today and hear some of his poems. Of his 3 books, the most recent is Human Wishes. The others are Field Guide and Praise, and I recommend them all to you very heartily indeed. Welcome, Bob.
Thank you. Thanks.
Nice to be here with you. I just had a few simple questions to ask. The main point really is to hear some poems, as far as I'm concerned. But I know you're commuting now back and forth between California and Washington. Mm-hmm. And I wonder how that's going. I wonder, in connection with that, how much teaching you're doing now, and if you're getting any writing done with all this travel.
Some. I teach my classes. I had to make an arrangement which I teach my classes at Berkeley on Mondays and Tuesdays this semester, all day Monday. So often I'm on the plane again on Tuesday. And how's it going? It's going. That's what I do.
Yeah, busy, huh?
Yeah.
And writing? You have any time for writing?
I've been able to finish a manuscript of a new book. I've been able to revise poems. I haven't started much new work, though. I've tried to keep. I've tried to keep track of this experience by writing a lot of stuff on public transportation, whether anything comes of it.
Mostly like journal entries and.
Well, journal entries. I thought I would write some taxicab haiku and airplane sonnets, and we'll see what comes.
I'm interested, of course, in the new book, and I wonder if you would describe the poems in it as more like the poems in Praise, mm-hmm. or more like those in Human Wishes. I'm thinking about the little prose poems in Human Wishes.
Yeah, there's no more prose of those experiments in prose, except that one long piece in which I got interested in experimenting with moving back and forth between verse and prose. And there's one poem in the new book that does that. But the rest of it is verse in various forms. Well,
I'm looking forward to that. But I like very much some of what you're calling experiments now in Human Wishes. And hope we can hear some of those and some others as well. Maybe we could begin with that, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You can read whatever you like, of course. I was most interested in hearing 2 of my favorites from the book. The Churchyard first.
The beginning of Churchyard is interesting to me because I started writing these things and I was thinking about the prose poem as it got called, and realized that in America it was typically packed full of what people thought of as imaginative writing, because it made them nervous to sound too much like prose, so it was full of a lot of zany metaphors and so on. So I got interested in using exactly the rhythms of prose to see what I could do with it. And when I wrote this first sentence one morning, it startled me. So this is Churchyard. Somerset Maugham said a professional was someone who could do his best work when he didn't particularly feel like it. There was a picture of him in the paper, a face lined deeply and morally like Auden's, an old embittered tortoise, the corners of the mouth turned down resolutely to express the idea that everything in life is small change. And what he said when he died, I'm all through, the clever young men don't write essays about me. In the fleshly world, the red tulip in the garden sunlight is almost touched by shadow and begins to close up. Someone asked me yesterday, are deer monogamous? I thought of something I had read. When deer in the British Isles were forced to live in the open because of heavy foresting, it stunted them. The red deer who lived in the Scotch Highlands 1,000 years ago was a third larger than the present animal. This morning, walking into the village to pick up the car, I thought of a roof where I had slept in the summers in New York, pigeons in the early morning sailing up Fifth Avenue, and silence in which you imagine the empty canyons the light hasn't reached yet. I was standing on the high street in Shelford Village outside the fussy little tea shop, and I thought a poem with the quick, lice-ridden pigeons in it might end, this is a dawn song in Manhattan. I hurried home to write it, and as I passed the churchyard, school was letting out. Luke was walking toward me, smiling. He thought I'd come to meet him. That was when I remembered the car, when he was walking toward me through the spring flowers and the 18th century gravestone, his arms full of school drawings he hoped not to drop in the mud.
Well, as I say, it's one of my favorites, and I think reading it, that incident at the end, where the father is coming home and sees the child with different expectations from his own, that must have happened. And the other one, the other particular favorite of mine is the one called A Story About the Body.
I'll read it. A Story About the Body. The young composer working that summer at an artist colony had watched her for a week. She was Japanese, a painter, almost 60, and he thought he was in love with her. He loved her work, and her work was like the way she moved her body, used her hands, looked at him directly when she made amused and considered answers to his questions. One night, walking back from a concert, they came to her door, and she turned to him and said, I think you would like to have me. I would like that too, but I must tell you that I've had a double mastectomy. And when he didn't understand, I've lost both my breasts. The radiance that he'd carried around in his belly and chest cavity, like music, withered very quickly, and he made himself look at her when he said, I'm sorry, I don't think I could. He walked back to his own cabin through the pines, and in the morning, he found a small blue bowl on the porch outside his door. It looked to be full of rose petals, but he found, when he picked it up, that the rose petals were on top. The rest of the bowl, she must have swept them from the corners of her studio, was full of dead bees.
I think the ending has one of my favorite effects in recent poetry. It reminds me of something Randall Jarrell says about Frost's design, that it's an unmistakable effect. Or so I thought at first. My first response was, she's saying to him in this eloquent way, when you looked at me, you thought I was all rose petals. And then you found out this fact of my surgery, and I became all dead bees to you. And it was about 2 days later when I had this other perception, and it filled me with a radiance like music to think it. She's also saying, your young man's attraction to me was such a pleasure to me at my age, across cultures and art forms. I thought you were all rose petals, but now I find out you're dead bees. I was moved by that.
I was talking this morning to some high school students in Columbia, and they were asking me what it meant, and of course I avoided the question, saying truthfully that I didn't think about it. I thought about the rhythm of the phrasing of it, and the student said, well, that's interesting, but I'd like to point out that bees pollinate flowers.
I've had students say something like that, and I read it. I've been reading it now and then at readings myself with your permission retrospectively.
Of course.
And I had a student at a high school get the second meaning first. I was very impressed. Well, thanks for that. I'd like to talk a little bit about your work in translation. I don't think I said in introduction, but Robert Hass is the chief translator now for Czeslaw Milosz, the great Polish Nobel laureate. And I wondered, in connection with that, how you work. If he does an English version first, he's of course lived in the States and California for many years and speaks impeccable English. If he does versions first, and how much Polish you've learned or picked up along the way?
Well, I've been doing this now for over 15 years, bringing this body of 50 years of work into English. And when I began, I knew no Polish at all. And in fact, I was curious to see some of his poems that had not been translated, that I'd read about. And so I was working with a friend of mine, a Polish journalist named Renata Gorczynski, and she would read them in Polish. We'd go over them word by word. She taught me Polish prosody, how the music of Polish verse worked, and would often give me a word-by-word, line-by-line commentary, and then do a tape. And then I would take it home and work on the poems. And then at a certain point, we would show them to Mr. Milosz. And then Renata left. I was midway in this project, very interested, and I began to work with Czeslaw directly. And at first, I asked him to imitate this process. And of course, I had by then discovered I was in this for a while, so I bought Polish grammars and dictionaries, tapes, very lazy about it. I was trying to study Japanese. In fact, I put off not learning Japanese in order to not learn Polish, but I've picked up a little. Now, as we do it over the years, he really makes the first draft in English, and sometimes they're quite good. Sometimes, if he's tired, the hardest thing for foreign speakers is to tell an ah from a the. Often that's all I do. You know, it can be very maddening to say, a man walked in the kitchen, or you say, the man walked in a kitchen. It's a huge difference. And
I think it has to do with Slavic. In Bulgarian, at least, articles come at the end of words, and articles are used much more sparingly than in English.
Yeah, it's true of Slavic languages, lots of languages, actually. So sometimes I just slightly depollinize his syntax. It's a matter of light editing. And sometimes a whole poem has to be reconceived, and we work at that together. We almost always, I mean, I always, of course, make a point of reading the original text, because sometimes he actually will rewrite the poem
I see.
As he's translating. So I'll say, well, why did you say this here? Why did you leave out this line about your father, or whatever? So I picked up a little, but really a very little Polish. I can make it through a newspaper haltingly.
That's pretty good.
Yeah,
that's pretty
at
good.
this point.
I've heard you speak together, and it appears that you've become quite good friends and work, it appears, closely. And so that seems to be a nice dividend as well.
Yeah, it's been wonderful working with him. Of course, he's an amazing man, and he's seen so much of the horror of the 20th century and written this great, complicated body of work. And he just doesn't think like an American in ways that are really interesting to me.
Can you read something of something you've translated from New York?
Sure. There's so much that I hardly know what to do. So I'm almost going to pick something as the book falls open. It's called A Confession. This was written in 1985 when he was 76 years old. My Lord, I love strawberry jam and the dark sweetness of a woman's body, also well-chilled vodka, herring and olive oil, scents of cinnamon, of clove. So what kind of prophet am I? Why should the Spirit have visited such a man? Many others were justly called and trustworthy. Who would have trusted me? For they saw how I empty glasses, throw myself on food, glance greedily at the waitress's neck, flawed and aware of it, desiring greatness, able to recognize greatness wherever it is, and yet not quite, only in part, clairvoyant. I knew what was left for smaller men like me, a feast of brief hopes, a rally for the proud, a tournament of hunchbacks, literature.
That's wonderful. And it's very like him, isn't it?
Yeah.
All of that immersion in the things of the world, the
Yeah.
sensory things of the world.
And this dark, brooding,
Yeah.
morose conscience and the humor.
That's wonderful. Maybe maybe you can read more later. Maybe we can talk a little about your work in the haiku that led to the Essential Haiku.
Yeah.
I have a lot of questions about that. I've been reading it with great pleasure, and I have heard you read from it before. I'm intrigued by, again, this question of how much Japanese you had to master in order to do this, or how you worked doing it.
Not very much. I was very attracted to the haiku because, for the reasons that everyone who is attracted, is the amazing clarity of seeing in the poems. But when I first looked at them, I guess I had from our youth, what translations of haiku there were typically in gift shop books. I thought of haiku as kind of the stuffed animal of poetry. And at a certain point, I began to see how impressive their seeing was, and then also to get some sense of the depths of the philosophical traditions that underlay what were apparently these very simple poems. So I started avidly reading and comparing translations, and of course then that raises the question. If you read it, one translation says, autumn evening, a crow has just settled on a bare branch, and another one says, a crow is perched on a bare branch, loneliness. You think, what did the man write? So I went to get dictionaries and grammars just to kind of see what was there. And often what I'd see is, with the 3 or 4 translations, how I would do it. And so I started making versions for myself, and it made me so happy. I just set myself the exercise of doing one a day for a long period of time. And then I fell in love with these 3 very different poets. I think are generally regarded as 3 of the 4 great masters in this tradition. So I would just do one a day. I had no thought at the time of making a book. I was just, I was reading, but you had, in order to read in this way in translation, you had to do them. And at a certain point, my publisher said, you should do a book of these. And I said, I want to wait until I learn more Japanese. And then I began working on the Milosz, and it drifted away. And then last year, I think he said, let's do a book of the haiku. Face it, you're never going to learn any more Japanese. So I went through as carefully as I could and read all of the English language and most of the French language scholarship on the poem, so I could make sure I'd gotten it more or less right and could annotate them in interesting ways.
Have you talked to Japanese speakers about them? Have you had
Yes.
any response from them?
Yeah, I was worried about what the scholarly journals would say about, and I try to make clear in the book that how limited my Japanese is. They've been responded very favorably.
Good.
Especially because I'd read all of their criticism, you know, so that, and the criticism is wonderful. There's a lot of good work. It's buried in obscure journals, but it's helpful in understanding the poems.
I'd like to hear some, of course, but there was one other thing that intrigued me. In the introduction, you say that all 3 of these poets living in the 17th century, the end of or the beginning of the 18th century, beginning and the last one, Issa, at the end of the century.
Yes.
That all 3 taught poetry. I was intrigued by that. I thought this was an American innovation, the workshop.
Yeah.
So I wondered what that meant to them.
Well, it's a bit complicated to explain, but I guess the first thing to say is that haiku, as Americans understand it, little 3-line or 17-syllable poem, 575, didn't really exist in Japan as an independent entity until the beginning of the 20th century. That little verse in the 17th century was called a haku, and it meant roughly a starting verse. There was a practice. It began in the courts, and it's very Japanese. It began really centuries earlier, in which they would take the typical 5-line poem and they'd improvise it in a call and response form, as if I wrote, we're sitting in the studio under the television lights, it's an October afternoon outside. Those 3 lines, you had to write 2 more lines to finish the poem. And then, which you could imagine a couple of Renaissance poets or a couple of American poets doing that. As the form developed, suppose your next 2 lines were there was broken light on the lake when the sun came up. So it would go, we're sitting in a television studio under the lights. Outside, it's a late March afternoon. There was broken light on the lake when the sun came up. A third poet would then take, there was broken light on the lake when the sun came up, and add another 3 lines to make a new 5-line poem. And then those 3 lines, someone else would take 2 lines and make
do a
new one. And you kept changing the subject. Once you took, there's broken light on the lake when the sun came up, it can't be autumn. It can't be spring anymore.
And it can't be the lake, and it can't be the sun coming up?
It can be, yeah. You say, there's broken light on the lake, and the sun was coming up.
Oh, I see, and then it changes.
And the last leaves are falling from the lime trees on the shore, or something like that. Now we're in autumn. Then you take, the last leaves are falling from the lime tree on the shore. Only one car's headlights through the village at this hour. Suddenly we're in the dark.
Right.
And then you could take only one car's headlights through the village at this hour. The sound of frogs on a summer morning. The season of the year keeps changing. The world shifts. What it conveys is a deeply Buddhist sense of the endless mutability of life. And that was the practice, and people got together and did it for pleasure, as an evening's recreation. And it became so popular that teachers were needed to teach people how to do it and to oversee the activities. And this profession of being a master of the Haku no Renga came into being. And Basho, Busan, and Issa, each at different times in their life, were, in this sense, haikai, as it was called, haikai masters. Teachers of this social, improvisatory social game of writing poetry. The nearest thing to it, really, in our tradition would be something like a 1920s jazz band, where you have somebody like Louis Armstrong
lays down a lick.
Lays down a lick, and then people improvise on
Right.
it, and he keeps bringing them back, and
Right.
and that was what it was like. There's really nothing like it in English. And these little individual sections were called haiku, and the form emerged from that.
Wonderful. I love hearing you talk about this stuff, and I do want to hear some haiku, but we haven't heard many of your own poems, and I wondered if you'd indulge me and read from your book, Prose, the image.
Oh,
Do you mind reading that?
Sure.
It's on page
Be happy
17.
to. What is this about? I don't know. I'll read it. I won't say what it's about. The image. The child brought blue clay from the creek, and the woman made two figures, a lady and a deer. At that season, deer came down from the mountain and fed quietly in the redwood canyons. The woman and the child regarded the figure of the lady, the crude roundnesses, the grace, the coloring like shadow. They were not sure where she came from, except the child's fetching and the woman's hands and the lead blue clay of the creek where the deer sometimes showed themselves at sunup.
It's marvelous. It reminds me of someone's definition of myth as at or near the boundaries of possibility, as if it's looking just over that somehow.
That's a wonderful phrase.
That's wonderful.
Who was that? You know?
I can't say I remember now where it came from. I wish it were mine.
You can have it. It's yours now.
But how about some haiku? We're just about out of time, and
Okay.
I'd love to hear some haiku.
Let me read some of the comic ones by Issa, which delight me. Don't worry, spiders, I keep house casually. Bats flying in a village without birds at dinner time. Noon, orioles singing, the river flows in silence. Goes out, comes back, love life of a cat. Mosquito at my ear. Does it think I'm deaf? Children imitating cormorants are even more wonderful than cormorants. Ideally, you should leave lots of quiet space around these things. But the effect of reading them rapidly is you get something like the effect of the haikai,
Of the
Orenga,
Orenga,
of this endless transformation of experience. So I'll do this for a minute. What a strange thing to be alive beneath plum blossoms. The man pulling radishes pointed my way with a radish. Deer licking first frost from one another's coats. Moon, plum blossoms, this, that, and the day goes. Asked how old he was, the boy in the new kimono stretched out all 5 fingers. A dry riverbed glimpsed by lightning. In this world, we walk on the roof of hell, gazing at flowers.
It seems impossible, but our few minutes are already over. Thanks, Bob, for being with us on The Writing Life. And thank all of you for joining us for a few minutes today.
Chat back and forth.
So...
The Howard County Poetry and Literature Society has been bringing distinguished writers to audiences since 1974. Cable audiences have enjoyed these national and international writers and poets through the series The Writing Life. To become a member or for more information on Hoka Palizzo, call 410-730-7524.